Today we talk with a well-established India hand, Iwanek, about the claims and clashes in the mountains, about the maritime claims, and also the exercise in Russia. Welcome to the show.
Much of a claim. Simply speaking, China has, in my opinion, no claim over Tibet at all. And without this claim, China cannot claim anything from India.
Welcome everyone. Today we have a new guest in our show. It's Krzysztof or Chris Iwanek from Poland. He spent also time in Asia. He was a lecturer in South Korea, and he goes every year frequently to India. So we have a great guest to talk today about India. Could you please tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hello, thank you for having me, Richard. Yes, indeed, my name is Krzysztof Iwanek, and indeed, it is easier to just call me Chris. I try to specialize in India, especially Indian politics, as well as internal as well as foreign policy. I am a head of the Asia Research Center at War Studies University in Warsaw, Poland. I also write texts for the Diplomat magazine, and indeed, I used to teach Hindi at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies in South Korea. Basically, everything I did professionally till now, or most of it, was connected in one way or the other to India.
Good, thank you. I would like to start first to ask you a little bit about the conflicts or disputes in the Himalayas. And then my question would be, how should we phrase it, or how should we call them? Are those contested or disputed borders, or maybe should we say they're just claimed by China? Because so far it seems that China is more or less the aggressor. And so what's your take on that?
Yeah, I guess that the more precise term would still be disputed territories. I would start with saying that it is indeed a very important dispute because independent India and independent China were having the dispute nearly since the beginning of the existence of the independent Republic of India. They haven't solved it till today, and it is a dispute that heavily influences their relations. I think disputed territories is more precise for the reason that rather than call it a disputed border, for the reason that, well, from their perspective, there is, especially from China's perspective, there is no border. There is no, delimited or demarcated border. This harks back to the colonial times, where most of India was ruled directly by the British. The rest of India was ruled indirectly by them. And in a nutshell, the British have been making, especially at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of 20th century, have been making certain advances, including territorial advances in the Himalayas by influencing or acquiring certain territories. So without getting into many details, the British have kind of by force or by pressure created certain political borders. Now, when the British left in 1947 and India gained independence, India assumed that those borders created in the Himalayas between what was then British India and independent Tibet were kind of, taken for granted as the border that will continue. However, well, China, first of all, soon after annexed Tibet. And secondly, China soon declared that they do not recognize any borders left by the British. So, well, one point, and the only point that China has here, is that these are indeed borders created by a colonial state. So why would Asian states, respect those borders? However, this is not where the Chinese claim has no basis. It has no basis in the first point, because the Chinese claim is only based on their claim to Tibet. Now they annexed Tibet, and parts of, let's say, historical and cultural broader Tibet. So independent political entities in the Himalayas, which were separate from Dalai Lama's state. So which were, let's say, other Tibetan states within Himalayas, such as
Okay.
Sikkim or Ladakh. These were not what China annexed, but China claims that, well, their right is to the entire Tibet, not just the state ruled by Dalai Lama, but every territory in the Himalayas that would be inhabited by Tibetans in the linguistic, historical, cultural, and religious sense, and that way China began to claim also territories which India happened to rule. Now India only ruled them, controlled them, because India inhabited those territories because they had been conquered by the British. So, uh, to be very frank, one could say that had history gone to a different course, maybe those such states as Ladakh, maybe they could have been independent. Just like Bhutan somehow remained independent, right? So I mean that was an option, but certainly that doesn't give China much of a claim. Simply speaking, China has, in my opinion, no claim over Tibet at all. And without this claim, China cannot claim anything from India, because the only territories that China is claiming, which are controlled by India, are the historically Tibetan territories in the Himalayas, no other ones. So uh, once we recognize that China simply annexed Tibet, all our other historical claims are gone. As for your other part of the question, who is the aggressor here? Well, the situation was, I would say, more complicated in 1950s and 1960s, where the dispute between India and China started, because at that time, well, China was the first to make moves. Well, annexing Tibet was the first aggressive move, without which nothing, and there would be no territorial dispute between India and China without annexing Tibet, because there would be no border they would share. Um, but then India in 1959 did also make some, between 1959 and 1962, made some bold moves that we could term aggressive as well, and the attitude of both countries was aggressive enough to lead to the war in 1962, which India lost. However, quickly moving back to today's time, um, as for the last few years, I would say that basically China is the more aggressive side. What happened in 2020, 2 years ago, is just a long continuation of that never resolved territorial dispute between India and China. And from what we understand, what happened in Ladakh in June 2020 was that it was the Chinese side that was aggressive, and it was the Chinese side that took control of a certain small territory controlled by India, a bend of a river which has certain strategic value for both sides.
Thank you. That's a lot. Yeah, when you mentioned that false claim from China, sounds a bit familiar. Living in Taiwan, but okay, I have another question. We have to maybe discuss. There was a time, though, recently where those countries lived kind of in peace, like 93 to 2013. There was this time where they kind of calmed down and put the quarrels on the back burner, and so actually the relationships seemed to develop quite well, I think, until the outbreak of the Wuhan virus. And then why would China take the risk and push India also, not only make India an enemy, but also push it towards the US? So was it
Yeah.
because they considered the place such a significant territory, or maybe because they didn't expect any backlash from India? What's your take?
Yeah, well, with hindsight, it is easier always to judge such time periods as the time period you mentioned once they are over. So indeed, most of the 1990s and the beginning of 2000s, so to speak, was relatively more a more calm period in India-China relations than what we have now. That's true. However, it must be also pointed out that during that period, they did not really resolve the territorial dispute at all. What happened was that at the beginning of the 1990s, India and China did achieve, and it was a significant achievement, did achieve the introduction of certain confidence building measures. Agreements signed between them did not resolve the control of the territory at all, but at least they created a certain procedures and measures how their armies could, coexist on that, disputed territory, because um, those countries, they are not only they claims that they overlap, but in a high complex territory such as Himalayas, it's sometimes difficult to actually know where one claims ends and the other begins, which means, and that led to so many security incidents which were possibly unintended, where a patrol of one side would meet a patrol on another side, and that could lead even to a skirmish, even if that was unplanned. Now, in 1990s, at least India and China worked out certain measures. For example, what the patrols should do in case they meet. They did not resolve the dispute, but at least it kind of lessened the risk of a war, but it did not remove the core problem, because the dispute remained, and they achieved nothing in terms of of solving this dispute, which meant that it was still like a barrel of dry gunpowder which could and still can explode anytime. So with hindsight, it was not enough to what they achieved in 1990s to to push away the risk of what finally happened in 2020. Secondly, why did happen now is I'm actually not sure. It's a bit puzzling. It's still possible that what happened in Ladakh in 2020, that battle nearly which happened between the soldiers, could have happened by by accident. By the way, the fact that they were fighting using only sticks and stones was exactly because of the measures introduced in 1990s. Without this, they could have been as well shooting at themselves. But while this could have still been an accident, because I don't see any particular logical reason for why it would happen in 2020. To give you a good example, if the fault was on the Chinese side, if that was deliberate, then I don't understand why that would happen in 2020, not 2021. Why? Because India went through its first, you mentioned the pandemic. The first wave of pandemic of COVID-19 that hit India, which was in 2020, was comparatively mild. And that was when the incident happened and soldiers on both sides lost their lives. Now, India went through a terrible second wave of COVID-19 in 2021, when there was much more chaos in the country. So, had that been had these skirmishes been deliberate actions on the side of the Chinese, they should have repeated this in 2021, when India was much more weaker and focused on internal problems, and nothing happened on the border, but nothing grand that we would have known of. So it is still possible. It was an incident that was kind of, once it happened and once blood was spilled on both sides, both countries, for political reasons, both governments had to act bold, because their own constituencies expected them to be bold, right? They couldn't take a step back. But well, as was China, so while this could have been an incident, basically I think also what happened in India-China relations is that, well, China basically, I think Beijing feels more bold than it was in 1990s. That doesn't have to be the reason for this particular incident, but I think it explains China's attitude to India, towards India, and not only India in particular. I mean, their diplomacy has clearly become more aggressive in the last decades or so, more or less, right? I think simply they feel they are economically, technologically, and militarily, in position to further their claims more than, because those claims have always been there. I mean, India always said that, China always said that those territories India controls should be there, those in the Himalayas, like Ladakh. But I think they feel bolder now than they were in 1990. So that's the general reason. By the way, as for India, Prime Minister Modi, who is also seen as bold, actually, it was not like this at the beginning of his first term. So, like in the years 2014, 15, up to 16, I would say, Modi did extend a hand towards Xi Jinping. There were those informal summits that they would have. They met in Wuhan before Wuhan started to be known for something else. They had a summit in Wuhan in China, and they held another summit in south of India. So something seemed apace. It seemed that at least India wanted a dialogue, but we know how this ended with nothing, basically. So it's not that India rekindled the dispute. Maybe the dispute kind of was rekindled on its own, but I think China's bold and aggressive attitude kind of added fuel to the fire.
Yes, you mentioned that China, the government likes to postpone definite solutions because, as you said, they always grow in power and have more strengths. It seems like we could maybe say that Indians seem to believe that you cannot have a productive relationship until these major disputes are first resolved, and the Chinese believe that you cannot resolve disputes until you have a productive relationship. And I think, yeah, they just push for trade and keep saying that we deal with the small matters later. So maybe we could finish now part one and discuss the maritime claims in part two. Thank you for watching the video. If you want more, like it. Please let me know in the comments who should I talk to next time. And if you didn't like it, share it.